It's 1971 in a filthy German nightclub, and Liza Minnelli is starting to think she's made one of the worst mistakes of her life. Liza's about to start filming Cabaret. It's a movie about a washed-up lounge singer and her queer boyfriend stumbling through 1930s Berlin during the rise of the Nazis.
What are we going to call it? Nifty Nazi Follies?
She's not the only one worried about this project. Her director's Bob Fosse, a former burlesque dancer whose previous film flopped so hard it nearly bankrupted Universal.
And it sent him into kind of movie jail.
Cabaret's his last chance to save his career, but he just had a fight with the producer so bad, they're no longer speaking.
I said, boy, we're going into the toilet with this.
Meanwhile, co-star Michael York just told Fosse that he hates the script, and the other co-star, Joel Grey, just learned that Fosse tried to replace him with the old lady from Harold and Maude.
Everyone has the right to make an ass out of themselves.
The entire experience is shaping up to be a huge disaster. But what none of them realize is that their weird little low-budget queer musical would become the stuff of Hollywood legend.
I had a sense that he was doing something very brave. I mean, none of us knew if it would work.
This is the story of Cabaret, the film that made icons out of its stars.
How grand!
Transformed the very genre of movie musicals.
Cabaret made people believe that you can go to a musical and believe it.
Influenced art and culture for decades to come, from Chicago to Schitt's Creek.
Cabaret! Yeah, I actually wanted to do Cats, but everybody said that it was too political, so.
And also served as a warning that's as timely today as it was back then.
They're lulling you into a feeling that makes you understand just how evil the evil is.
Lulling, boom.
Yeah.
Our story starts at a dinner party at the home of Hal Prince. Hal is a Broadway power broker. He produced a string of hits: Damn Yankees, West Side Story, Fiddler on the Roof, and he'd go on to produce even more, like Evita, Sweeney Todd, Phantom of the Opera. One night in 1970, Hal and his wife invited a few friends over for dinner. There was Neil Simon and his wife, the dancer Joan Simon, dancer Gwen Verdon, and Gwen's husband, Bob Fosse. But when Bob arrived, something was clearly eating at him. He was gloomy. He found a seat on the floor. He didn't talk much. Hal Prince, the producer, tried to keep the conversation going. He mentioned he was about to start work on a new Broadway show, and he added that's why he wouldn't be able to direct the movie version of Cabaret. And suddenly there was a voice from the floor. The movie version of Cabaret? Bob Fosse was frantic. He had to know who's producing it, who's financing, and do they need a director? Why was this so urgent for Bob? Because he was in a tough spot. Bob Fosse was a dancer who'd come up in vaudeville in the 1940s, starting in dingy burlesque and strip clubs. He taught himself a signature move, a backflip, that caught the attention of MGM scouts, and they started putting him in big, bright, happy musicals of the 1950s. Bob's talent and his signature move seemed like guaranteed job security, as long as audiences kept flocking to musicals, which they did for many years, until they stopped. Tastes changed in the 1960s. With the turmoil of the decade, audiences started losing interest in movies that were full of upbeat song and dance. Bob thought it was time for a new kind of musical, one with more serious themes and realistic, gritty settings. That had worked well enough with adaptations like West Side Story, and he got a chance to try it out when he directed the film Sweet Charity. It's about a sex worker who falls in love with a movie star. A gorgeous movie with amazing, iconic dances that left a big impression on culture, from Ariana Grande to Beyoncé to The Simpsons.
Hey, big spender! Dig the splendor!
But when it came out, Sweet Charity bombed. The general consensus was it was way over-directed. Too many camera tricks, too many artsy shots that were just disorienting. It also didn't help that Fosse went way over budget, so the movie lost a ton of money. It was so bad that some executives at MCA Universal talked about getting out of the movie business completely so they could focus on less risky music and television. So not only did Sweet Charity ruin Bob's reputation, it showed the industry that musicals were becoming a big risk. It seemed like it might be one of the last nails in the coffin of a struggling genre. And after his first film bombed, Bob couldn't get hired. He and Gwen were living on savings. They were desperate for work.
It was pretty cold. I mean, no one really wanted me for a long time.
So when he heard about a film adaptation of Cabaret, Bob thought this could be the second chance that he desperately needed. Why this show in particular? Because Bob saw something unique about Cabaret. The show had its origins in a series of short stories that were written by Christopher Isherwood. He was a British writer who'd moved to Berlin in the late 1920s, and he wrote about Berlin's then vibrant gay scene, his friendship with a cabaret singer, and how the art and culture and freedom of the time was destroyed as the Nazis came to power. In Isherwood's stories, the characters all look away from the danger that the Nazis pose. They're distracted by the fun and life on stage. And that appealed to Bob because he wanted to use the stage as a metaphor for human corruptibility, to show how, on stage and in life, people can be distracted by something dazzling rather than seeing the urgent danger right in front of them. The stories had been adapted before, but they were heavily sanitized. In the 1950s, the writer Dodie Smith, the author of 101 Dalmatians, declared that Isherwood stories would never work on stage. A playwright friend took that as a challenge and wrote a play called I Am a Camera. It was a modest success and was made into a film.
This winter there are many who do not have clothes to cover them.
Yes, I know.
And I'm one of them.
But those 50s versions removed some of the darker elements. There's less focus on the Nazis, and censors demanded that sexual elements be removed, and that promiscuous characters face some punishment. They also made the main character straight instead of gay. Even with those edits, I Am a Camera was seen as awfully controversial. It was a struggle to get permission to stage the play, and the film version was denied a certificate to be shown in the US. So these more sanitized versions left a lot of material in the Isherwood stories that just hadn't been explored, and a lot of unused potential that a new film version could tap into. Especially because this new film version wouldn't be based on the old I Am a Camera adaptation. It would be based on a newer musical version that had been a hit on Broadway. The Broadway musical was called simply Cabaret. It was directed by Hal Prince, who'd updated the story and added some new elements. Hal's goal was to use 1920s Berlin as an allegory for racism and the rise of fascism in 1960s America. To drive home just how similar those times were, Hal brought a photo of angry protesters to the first rehearsal of Cabaret. Everyone assumed it was Aryan youth in Nazi Germany, but it was actually a photo of men protesting school integration in Chicago taken in the last year. The Broadway version had a surprising cast. Jill Hayworth, a former horror queen who played the damaged, chaotic cabaret singer Sally Bowles, and Joel Grey, a then-closeted actor largely known for TV westerns, who played the club's sinister MC.
Welcome and bienvenue, welcome.
Like the other adaptations, the Broadway musical was initially controversial.
When we first played our very first performance in Boston, the Shubert Theater totally exploded. We couldn't go on with the show.
Over time, it grew in popularity. It won 8 Tonys. There was an international production with Sally played by Judi Dench.
Don't tell Mama, whatever you do.
So with that success on stage, why hadn't Cabaret been adapted into a film yet? It wasn't for lack of trying. Hal Prince had sold the film rights to a company called Cinerama in 1968, but then a few months later, Cinerama tried to back out. There were some lengthy court battles, and finally the rights were bought by another company called Allied Artists at a steep discount. Allied Artists was in a tricky spot, though. It was on the verge of going bankrupt. They hadn't made a new film in years. To help produce, Allied Artists brought on a guy named Cy Feuer. Cy was an experienced Broadway producer. His credits included Guys and Dolls, How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. Cy knew that one of their first orders of business needed to be finding a director. And he might have offered that job to Hal Prince, since Hal had directed it on Broadway. But now, it was too late. Hal had moved on. He was about to start work on a new Stephen Sondheim show called Company, which was sure to be less challenging than adapting Cabaret.
Wrong!
Cy Feuer and Bob got together for lunch, and it was tense. According to Cy, he had pasta, Bob had a pack of cigarettes.
I am in flavor country.
Bob made the case for himself, knowing he was considered damaged goods as a director. Fosse's vision was for something more shocking than audiences had seen on stage, to use the cabaret as a metaphor for how people can be blinded to the dangers around them. In this case, the rise of the Nazis. Cy heard him out, but he said before he gave the job to him, he'd have to consider some more prestigious directors. He was also talking to Billy Wilder, Gene Kelly, Joe Mankiewicz, all of them much more powerful, with a successful track record. Fosse had made one film, and it was a flop, but he was desperate for this job. He told Cy, "I've got to do it. It's my last shot. I can't get arrested in Hollywood." And there was one thing working in Fosse's favor. Cy had a hunch that Cabaret's success would depend on its musical numbers. And he knew that whatever Fosse's failings as a director might be, he was one of the best choreographers in the world. Plus, they could always hire Bob to do the choreography, and then fire and replace him if he was a lousy director. That's basically what happened with Jerome Robbins on West Side Story. Cy went back to his colleagues at Allied Artists and told them they had to get Fosse. So they hired him, but nervously. Sweet Charity was still on their minds, And after agreeing to hire him,
I said, boy, we're going into the toilet with this.
So now Fosse had the job, but he knew his bosses were watching him like a hawk. He was going to have to pull off what seemed like an impossible task. Saving his directing career with a film about an incredibly off-putting topic made it what might be the worst possible point in history for a musical film. Work on the screenplay had already started with J. Preston Allen, an acclaimed writer known for working with luminaries like Alfred Hitchcock, Katharine Hepburn, Barbra Streisand. But she struggled to adapt Cabaret from the Broadway musical to the screen. Allen knew that film audiences' tastes had changed. Musicals were a tough sell. Even family musicals like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang were struggling to recoup their costs. Other musical films had tried to go for a more adult tone around this time, but those often wound up being huge disasters.
Skidoo, skidoo.
And on top of that was the incredibly unpleasant subject matter, the rise of the Nazis. Sure, there had been Nazis in musicals before, like The Sound of Music, but Cabaret's dark theme of human corruptibility was a far cry from the simple, clear-cut morality of a Rodgers and Hammerstein show, or, for that matter, from the playfulness of a Walt Disney film. The discomfort with the subject matter was highlighted when they started planning their shoot. They wanted to film the movie in Germany, but Germans were not eager to relive the trauma of World War II. Fosse was confused when he couldn't find any costumes that matched the time period, and he later found out that the costume shop had hidden them because they were afraid Cabaret would recreate pre-war Germany too authentically. One costume designer who was told to find outfits like they had before the war responded, "What war?
Listen, don't mention the war."
World War II had ended less than 30 years earlier. It would be like making a movie now about the 1990s. The horrors of the time were still very fresh in many people's minds. Another challenge when it came to adapting Cabaret was that Fosse and Cy Feuer were both tired of musicals where people just burst into song. They wanted to heighten the story's realism by only having musical numbers take place on a stage, where it would make sense for people to sing. Plus, the more they talked about it, the clearer it became that Cy Feuer hated major sections of the stage version. He found it too sentimental, especially a love story that the Broadway version added about an elderly landlady. Cy thought it was too cute, and he wanted to get rid of that entire storyline. And that didn't leave much that they did like. So ultimately, they decided to throw out huge chunks of the musical, including some very popular songs. And that gave them a fresh slate, a chance to reinvent Cabaret for a new audience, but it also raised a new question: what would they use instead? And that's when they started looking back at the original stories by Christopher Isherwood. He had a fascinating real-life story. In his early 20s, Isherwood was a student at Oxford, but he hated the stifling atmosphere of the stuffy British school. He preferred to write fiction, specifically erotic stories that he traded with his friend Edward.
I used to write a story and take it into his rooms late at night when he was in bed. Next day I'd find one from him on my table.
At the end of one term, Isherwood filled an exam book with joke answers, and the school had enough. They asked him not to come back.
I threw away my whole brilliant academic career.
Trying to figure out what to do next, Isherwood heard there was a lot of artistic freedom in Berlin. And something else that interested him.
In your own words, Berlin meant boys. Is that more or less right?
Oh, yes, sure.
So off he went.
There was an escape there from the upper middle class to which I belonged. And I wanted to be with these boys, to escape into another sort of world.
And he found just what he was looking for. In Berlin, Isherwood wrote about exploring the local gay scene, about meeting and dating men, about a friend named Jean, who he renamed Sally for the books, and her wild, rambunctious life as a cabaret singer. And as he spent more time there, he saw what was happening politically, and he described the violent, frightening rise of the Nazis, seeing his friends arrested, tortured, killed, and how calmly so many Germans had accepted it. Isherwood wound up leaving Germany in the nick of time with his German boyfriend in 1933, and he published his books in the years leading up to World War II. Fosse was drawn to many of the details in those stories, especially Berlin's sexual freedom. He saw a parallel with America's sexual revolution of the 1960s. And he liked that the main character of the books was queer. He talked it over with J. Preston Allen, the writer, and at that point, queer characters in movies had tended to adhere to the same tropes, mincing and effeminate.
I may not know my flowers, but I know a bitch when I see one.
But they thought this could be a chance to do something different, to show a queer character that was more complex and nuanced than the same old stereotypes. In Fosse's words, to startle the audience and make them rethink their perceptions of what a gay man looks like.
Because, my God, what year was that, 1972? It was a little late in the day for all that prissy business.
And that's what they decided should be the basis of their film. The original Isherwood stories, including details that had been sanitized out of the earlier adaptations. They were going to set their film apart from other movie musicals by making it more gritty, more realistic, and more queer. They'd also enlarge the part of Sally Bowles, cabaret singer who's flighty, carefree, lives for the moment with no responsibilities. For that, they were interested in Liza Minnelli. It made sense. The role on Broadway had originally been written for her. So why wasn't she in it? Well, when they were casting, Hal Prince had her audition, but he thought she couldn't play British believably, that her singing was too refined for the character of Sally, and that she simply wasn't up to the task of acting as sloppy as the role required.
You know what? It's his loss.
But Cy Feuer thought she might be worth a closer look. Liza wasn't the same performer she once was. For one thing, Hal's rejection had stuck with her, and she decided that if Cabaret was ever turned into a film, she wanted that role.
It's his loss!
So she spent the next few years honing her acting skills, building up film credits and roles that she hoped would prove she belonged in a gritty adult part like Sally Bowles. Why'd that part matter so much to her? Because ever since she was little, Liza was compared to her mother, Judy Garland. Now, Liza loved and admired her mom, but she also needed to prove herself, as she put it, for the world to say, there she is in a musical, and that's what her mom did, and she's holding her own. So she went after a lot of unusual, unexpected roles, often with a grittier edge than those associated with Judy. Liza played a fashion designer struggling to make ends meet during the Depression, a college student going through a nervous breakdown, a woman whose face is scarred by acid, whose close confidant is her gay best friend. And she turned down roles that she felt were too similar to her mother's, including offers from Walt Disney, who probably wanted her for a Wizard of Oz project that wound up taking a very different form.
When you're made of patches, life's a gay and giddy holiday.
It was a years-long campaign to prove she had it in her, and audiences took notice. In those rougher, edgier roles, she won a Tony, she was nominated for an Oscar and a BAFTA and a Golden Globe. Her star was on the rise. Hal felt she was still wrong for the role, but it wasn't his call anymore, and producer Cy Feuer was willing to give her a chance. Cy and some colleagues went to see Liza perform at a cabaret in Paris. She knew he was coming and ended her show with the title song from Cabaret.
I still remember it vividly because my hair, and those days I had a lot more hair than now, literally stood up on the back. I could feel this thing on the back of my head as it worked toward the front. It was incredible.
And Cy cast her on the spot. After the rejection years earlier and all those years of work, this was huge vindication. But Liza never had any doubt.
She sat on the floor, cross-legged, and said, "Don't worry, fellas, I'm going to be great."
You know, when you're really young and you think in such a straight line, things are much simpler then. Because you're stupid, and it's good.
Now she'd have to prove she could actually live up to the part to see if her confidence was really justified. Fosse didn't have any input on the casting of Liza. Cy let him know she came with a picture. Fortunately, Fosse liked her. But other casting choices didn't go so smoothly. For her co-star, the stand-in for the Isherwood narrator, they wanted what they called a Michael York type. Michael York was a young British actor who's mostly known for Shakespeare and period dramas, though he may be better known now for this role.
I'm Basil Exposition with British Intelligence.
At the time, Michael had played a string of characters that he found boring. And when he heard what Fosse was looking for...
They were actually looking for a Michael York type, and I suggested to my agent that possibly I might qualify.
Fosse auditioned him and liked what he saw, but Liza didn't. She just didn't feel the chemistry. She didn't think he looked the part. But Fosse didn't listen. He told Michael, the part is yours. But then Michael had to confess he had a problem. He'd just seen the latest version of the script, and he had one thought.
I've made a huge mistake.
He told Fosse the character was bland. He just passively watches, doesn't take any action. He's boring. And Michael was thinking, maybe Liza was right. Maybe he should pull out. That was a huge crisis, because this was supposed to be one of the main characters in the film. They'd made his relationship with Sally the heart of the story, and at this point, Fosse didn't have much time to recast. So, what could he do? Well, there were 2 weeks of song and dance rehearsals coming up, and Fosse decided to devote a big chunk of that to overhauling the scenes with Liza and Michael. He got them into a room together to run scenes and improvise, and a new writer, Hugh Wheeler, came along to capture whatever they came up with. As they rehearsed, they started finding new ways to play the characters, new dialogue to make the relationship more interesting, inspiration that Hugh used to polish into fully fleshed out scenes. And at the end of 2 weeks, they had a script that they loved. Michael York was thrilled. The only thing he asked not to do was a scene where he describes his dick with a Shakespeare quote.
Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?
Liza had come around too. She told Fosse, I was wrong, he's sensational. The cast was finally starting to gel. But then came another road bump. There was already some tension over the casting of the MC. That's the character who reigns over the cabaret. On stage, he's played by Joel Grey, but Hal Prince had used the character to represent the soul of Germany, growing more deranged and maniacal over the course of the show. Joel seemed like a shoo-in for the film. But then one day he happened to be sitting in the waiting room of his dentist's office, picked up a copy of Variety, and read that Fosse wanted to cast Ruth Gordon instead. That's the nosy neighbor from Rosemary's Baby, Maude from Harold and Maude.
Yeah, I saw that movie, Harold and Maude, and I really don't want to talk about it.
Joel was flabbergasted. He liked Ruth, but he felt very protective of this character. And it was especially surprising since he and Bob Fosse had the same agent. That put the agent in a very awkward position. He tried to explain to Joel why Fosse was reluctant to cast him.
He wanted nothing to do with what was on the stage.
But Joel was still upset.
I had as much an investment in that movie as he did.
He really wanted to bring that character to life on the big screen for millions of people to see what he'd done on Broadway. And he had his own thoughts about what might actually be going on.
My secret suspicion was that he was hoping that it would be impossible to find someone and that he would end up doing it.
Finally, with just a few weeks left until shooting and the character still not cast, the producers forced Fosse into a room to make a decision. They pointed out Joel had done a perfectly good job on Broadway. Bob tried to throw his weight around.
He said to everybody, it's either Joel Grey or me. And Marty Baum, who was the producer, said, then it's Joel Grey.
So Fosse begrudgingly accepted Joel. But that didn't lead to particularly warm feelings in rehearsal. When they first met, Bob was frosty. He avoided talking, except to criticize. Bob told Joel he wasn't doing enough jazz hands. Every time Joel tried to improvise, Bob shot him down. Finally, Bob took Joel aside and asked him,
Joel, have you ever done a backflip?
Joel told him, I don't think so. And Bob said, it's easy. And he prepared to go into one of his trademark flips.
And he proceeded to jump and do a backflip and missed and fell right on his face and laid there.
For a moment, everyone thought Fosse might be dead. And then he pulled himself up and limped off. And the next day, he showed up with his face swollen and bruised, a cigarette hanging from his lips. It was the last time Fosse asked Joel to try a backflip. The tension got even worse as they looked for a cinematographer. Fosse wanted to hire Robert Surtees, who'd shot Oklahoma and Ben-Hur, and Fosse's first film, Sweet Charity. The producer, Cy Feuer, was reluctant to hire Surtees, because he was expensive. But he told Fosse he'd try to persuade the other producers. At that point, they were scouting locations in Munich, and Fosse was starting to wonder just what Cy was telling those other producers. One night, they stayed at a hotel where their rooms were right next to each other. Fosse could hear Cy was on the phone, and he put his ear to the wall. And what he heard was, I don't want Surtees, and I won't let Fosse have him. Bob realized he'd been lied to. Cy Feuer had no intention of making good on their agreement. Bob was furious. He paced for hours trying to figure out what to say, or if he should say anything. He ran through all of their past conversations, wondering if it was all lies. And the next morning, Cy heard pounding on his door. He opened it in his robe, and he saw Fosse still wearing his clothes from the day before. Before Cy could say anything, Fosse told him, I heard your whole conversation, you no good son of a bitch. All of the color drained from Cy's face, and he collapsed into a chair. Fosse went on a rant, accusing Cy of betraying him, of not trusting him to direct, of only hiring him for the choreography. It was like their entire collaboration was disintegrating before Cy's eyes. And finally, Cy had heard enough. He stood up and he said, listen, prick, you don't know what was going on the other end of that conversation. The guy wants to fire you. Fosse stood right up against him and said, if you want me out, you're gonna have to fire me. That was followed by a long pause. This was a crazy gambit. Remember, Fosse's whole career was riding on making this film, and Cy Feuer had just told him how easily he could be fired. Their tempers still flaring, Feuer said, I'm not going to do that, because I want to make this picture, you stupid son of a bitch. Ultimately, Feuer told people, he needed Fosse. I had no idea how to do it without him. And although he hadn't told Fosse this, if the other producers had fired him, Cy would have quit. After that, Fosse stormed out of the hotel room. He still had the job, but now he and Cy Feuer were bitter enemies. From that point on, they refused to talk to each other unless they had to. Fuhrer avoided coming to set, Fosse ignored him, and that simmering anger hung over the entire production as they headed into filming in the summer of 1971, with many still doubting where Fosse was taking them.
I had a sense when we were shooting Cabaret that he was doing something very brave. I mean, none of us knew if it would work.
The film opens with the character based on Isherwood, now renamed Brian, arriving in Berlin. It's 1931. He meets Sally, a singer who works at a cabaret overseen by a creepy MC. Sally and Brian have both come to Berlin for the same thing, freedom. To throw off the restrictions of their stuffy old lives and try something new. Brian to write, Sally to perform.
I'm going to be a great film star. That is, if booze and sex don't get me first.
Sally takes Brian on a whirlwind tour of the city. She shows off how wild and exciting Berlin is. She also flirts a little bit with Brian.
Doesn't my body drive you wild with desire? Well, doesn't it?
He's not interested, and he's hesitant to say why at first. But it doesn't take Sally long to guess.
Maybe you just don't sleep with girls. Oh.
Turns out, he didn't need to be so nervous about it. To Sally, it's no big deal.
We're practically living together. So if you only like boys, I wouldn't dream of pestering you.
Her nonchalance parallels the real-life attitude in much of Berlin around this time. In most of the world, queer people had to stay hidden. There were harsh laws and social stigma that made it dangerous to be found out. But Germany had a surprisingly open queer scene. At the time, Germany offered wide-ranging freedom of press and assembly. That made it possible for activists to organize groups throughout the country so queer people could find each other and push for reform. Activists like Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, who's often referred to as the first person to publicly identify himself as a gay man. Ulrichs was also responsible for one of the first gay vampire novels. And we don't have room for that whole story here, but I'm posting a bonus video about that over on Patreon. In the 1920s, Berlin was an especially gay-friendly city. When Isherwood was there, it was full of gay magazines, gay theaters, gay bars, similar to what you might find in many cities today. There was even an Institute for Sexual Research in Berlin, led by Magnus Hirschfeld, who helped push for early legal protections for queer people. Hirschfeld worked with the government to create legally recognized identification for trans people, so they were no longer arrested. And in Cabaret, you can see a reflection of the safety that queer people found in Berlin. There are gender non-conforming characters in the club, like Elke, who's played by the British drag performer Ricky Renee. In real life, people like Elke flocked to Berlin from all over the world to escape violence and arrest that they faced elsewhere. And of course, there was also opposition to queer liberation in Germany, especially from the growing Nazi movement. But at least at first in Cabaret, the Nazis are only hinted at. They're a minor background detail. Some characters express a concern about them, like Brian's Jewish friend, who poses as a Gentile for his own safety.
To be a Jew in Germany. Only a fool is this, I think. So, I come to Berlin, and I'm not a Jew.
But he's an exception in the film. For the time being, it's easy for the main characters to ignore the Nazis and the swastikas and enjoy the carefree fun around them. As he gets to know the city, Brian discovers its surprising sexual freedom. He gets a job translating pornography. Sally gets to perform, party until late, enjoy attention from men, and all the while, their friendship deepens. Brian starts to care for Sally more and more. And then, one night, Brian and Sally discover that his interests are broader than he thought, and they sleep together. Afterwards, Brian realizes he's in love with Sally. But Sally doesn't take things quite so seriously. To her, it's just a casual fling, nothing to think twice about. All part of the freedom that she came to Berlin for. She's especially tickled when a rich count named Max starts courting her. And to Brian's surprise, the count starts courting him, too.
I think it's my duty to corrupt you, agreed?
The count's attention is beguiling for both of them. It makes it easy to ignore the fact that the Nazi presence is growing. It's not just in the background anymore. When a club bouncer tries to throw a Nazi out, the bouncer's beaten, possibly killed. Fosse crosscuts the beating with a comic song to show that what's happening inside the cabaret is a reflection of what's happening outside. And to show how easily the German public is distracted from the violence, how easily they laugh it off. The MC, who represents the attitude of the country, is getting more sinister. Brian notices things are getting out of hand, especially when they pass a scene of Nazi violence. But Max dismisses it.
The Nazis are just a gang of stupid hooligans.
He says the Nazis are useful because they oppose the communists. Besides, he says, they'll never be too powerful. They'll always be easy to control. That attitude has real-life parallels too, even among Berlin's real gay leaders. Some sounded the alarm about the Nazis, but others aligned themselves with them. like Adolf Brand, who formed gay social clubs and openly espoused beauty ideals based on Germanic racial purity. Or Friedrich Radzuzweit, a powerful publisher who argued that queer people didn't need to fear the Nazis as long as gays behaved respectably and weren't Jewish. But collaboration and dismissal of the Nazi threat was wrong, both in real life and in the film. Brian's Jewish friend can see the danger. He's met a woman he wants to marry, but if he does, people would find out that he's a Jew, which he knows would put him in danger. His girlfriend is known to be Jewish, and she's targeted by the Nazis. Her dog's killed, a threat about what could happen next. But Sally and Brian don't feel like they have to worry. They feel secure with Max, the Count, and their threesome gets more intimate. Max makes big promises about using his money to look after them, traveling the world. With his protection, it seems like whatever threat the Nazis might pose are someone else's problem. But then, they're at a beer garden, and a kid starts singing a patriotic song. At first, it seems innocent, idyllic.
The stag in the forest runs free.
And then they realize who's singing.
The branch of the linden is leafy and green.
And they watch as more and more Germans join in.
Fatherland, show us a sign.
Until the attitude of the gathering becomes clear.
Tomorrow belongs to me.
And the MC watches over the whole thing with approval. Brian leaves the gathering with a message for the Count, and for anyone else who would downplay the threat of rising fascism.
You still think you can control them?
The danger's especially growing for their Jewish friends. They decide to get married, which means they can't hide anymore. And the romance is met with a chilling response from the MC. At first, it seems like a comic ballad, a love song about a gorilla.
If you could see her through my eyes, you wouldn't wonder at all.
At the club, the German audience loves it. And when the song first appeared in the Broadway show, audiences there loved it too.
If you could see her through my eyes, I guarantee you would fall like I did.
And then he gets to the punchline. He sings, "If you could see her through my eyes,
she wouldn't look Jewish at all."
That shocked audiences. They were outraged, to the point that the punchline was removed from the stage version. And Fosse and Joel recorded the line without music, so it could be removed from the film if necessary. But the outrage is the point, that things have gotten so bad that the MC can be so gleefully, openly anti-Semitic should be deeply outrageous. But that's still not Sally and Brian's concern. They've got the Count to protect them. Until Max abruptly leaves Germany. His promises were all lies. He simply abandons them. He leaves them a little money and a fur coat. Now they're on their own, in a Berlin that's growing increasingly dangerous. The Nazis are no longer easy to overlook. They're everywhere. When Brian lashes out at them, he's beaten. The easy, carefree life they once enjoyed is shrinking away, replaced with terrible danger.
I hear you took on the entire Nazi party single-handed.
And again, this parallels the real-life conditions of the time. As the Nazis rose to power, they often attacked people who thought they were safe. Like that gay publisher, Friedrich Radzufeit. He tried to placate conservative forces by endorsing their theories about homosexuality being contagious. But when they took power, they raided and shut down his gay magazines. That other leader, Adolf Brand, considered Radzufeit a rival and celebrated the destruction of his publications. But then they went after Brand too, shutting him down. Neither one of them survived the war. Trying to compromise with the Nazis didn't protect them. Nazis didn't care, they were the good ones. They went after them anyway. As Sally and Brian deal with Max leaving, they get another bombshell.
God damn it, I'm gonna have a baby!
It's a shock. But they talk it over and decide this could be the start of a new life. And they start planning to marry. But as they form those plans, Sally ruminates on everything she'd have to give up. The fun, carefree life at the club, the attention, the casual sex, not having to be responsible for anyone else. That's the life that she wants. In the end, she decides she'd be a terrible mother.
How soon would it be before we started hating each other?
She sells the coat that the Count left them to get an abortion. And that's another detail that was fairly accurate to the time. In real life, an abortion would have been relatively easy to obtain in Berlin. It wasn't legal for everyone, but restrictions had been relaxing over the previous few years. Germany was on a path toward more reproductive freedom in the 1920s, and it seemed possible abortion might be fully legalized soon. But that was another target for the Nazis. When they came to power, they imposed draconian restrictions on reproductive care. Eventually, that included the death penalty for performing abortions. The only exception was for Jews and other groups that Nazis wanted to wipe out. After all of those years of progress, it was a devastating slide backwards. And the laws that the Nazis passed were especially tenacious. Some of them were repealed, but other restrictions remain in effect today. Reproductive choice was also a timely issue in the US when Cabaret was made. In America, abortion had been criminalized for years, although people with money were still able to get them. But in the 1960s, a few states legalized it. And by the early 70s, there was a patchwork of protections from state to state, similar to what the US had with marriage equality for a long time. And when Cabaret came out in 1972, Roe v. Wade was just in the process of being decided. Abortion was a plot point in other films around this time, but it was usually portrayed as something terrible and traumatic, like the movie Blood Mania.
Terror that rips the screams right out of your throat.
Or End of the Road, where it's associated with torture and death. Daddy's Gone A-Hunting, where a woman's abortion is punished by a stalker. Cabaret is noteworthy for presenting abortion without judgment or stigma, even presenting it as ultimately the right thing for Sally to have done. An extremely timely depiction. And Cabaret was more than just a timely examination of current events. It was also a timely warning. The film shows a country that enjoyed a period of greatly expanding freedoms, but was on the brink of losing it all. When Cabaret was made, America had just gone from the conservative 1950s into the civil rights movement, the sexual liberation of the 60s. The Voting Rights Act gave Americans more access to democracy. Stonewall and Prides allowed queer people to live more freely. Expanding reproductive choice gave people more control over their bodies. There was a lot of progress in a short amount of time. But there was also a backlash, a conservative movement led by forces like Richard Nixon, Strom Thurmond, Ronald Reagan. They used the progress of the 1960s as a scare tactic to whip up support among their followers. They promised to roll things back, to make America like it used to be.
Ronald Reagan for president. Let's make America great again.
And that's why Fosse felt that the setting of Cabaret was so productive for commenting on contemporary times. Cabaret shows how easily an audience, either at a club or a voting public, could be distracted and manipulated. That as safe as Brian and Sally and all their friends felt, how vulnerable they really were. At the climax of Cabaret, we see Sally choose distraction over reality. After she has her abortion and ends her relationship with Brian, her final song is about her decision to remain willfully, blissfully ignorant of the troubles around her. The lyrics of her song declare, "What good's permitting some prophet of doom to wipe every smile away? Life is a cabaret, old chum, come to the cabaret." She sings about her wish to live like a friend who died young and happy. When I saw her laid out like a queen,
she was the happiest corpse I'd ever seen.
The message of the song: life doesn't have to be sad. It can be a cabaret, a place to enjoy yourself, as long as you ignore or deny the problems around you. But in the final moments of the film, we can see the problems that she is choosing to ignore. The MC comes out to make a speech.
We have no troubles here. Here life is beautiful.
But his words ring false. He slips away and the camera pans to a mirror reflecting the audience. And we can see Nazis sitting among them. Lots of them. While Sally was singing, they were taking over her space. And now, there's too many to get rid of. Just a few months after this film takes place, in real life, the German president would appoint Hitler as chancellor. Within weeks, they passed laws rescinding freedom of press and assembly, which meant it was no longer safe for queer people to gather, to communicate, to express themselves in public. The rights that had made Germany a safe haven for so many people in the first place. Then came the raids. Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Research was among the first, and his work was burned. The Nazis also went hunting for address books. They compiled lists of homosexuals and started rounding them up. So if you happen to have subscribed to one of those magazines or gave your name and address to a friend, you might be arrested and taken away. And of course, they didn't just come for gays. The Nazis raided the headquarters of political enemies and had them arrested, many executed. If you belonged to the wrong political party, you might just vanish. They forced labor unions to disband, so there were no protections at work. Jews were forcibly removed from their jobs. They revoked the passes that Hirschfeld had developed for transgender people that allowed them to appear in public. In fact, trans people were a particular target for Nazi violence. And although there have been some who deny that trans people were among the Nazis' victims, the German legal system has ruled they absolutely were, and to claim otherwise is considered a denial of Nazi crimes. Along with those crackdowns came a rapid military buildup. By March of 1933, Germany had built its first concentration camps, and began systematic arrests without warrant. First of political enemies, and within a few years, queer people, Jews, people with disabilities, Romani, black people, Jehovah's Witnesses, and more. Millions of people rounded up and murdered. The safe haven for people from all over the world wiped out in a matter of months, replaced with the regime that, over the next decade, would be responsible for the worst atrocities of the 20th century. Knowing what's coming makes the last shot of Cabaret especially chilling. It's not just a shot of the audience, it's a mirror. It makes the viewer reflect on themselves, suggests that you, watching this film, might be surrounded by dangerous people who could turn on you, or that maybe you're one of them. Those dark themes are exactly what Fosse wanted to convey with Cabaret. They wrapped filming on September 7th, 1971. But the film wasn't done. Now they had to figure out how they would fit the pieces together, and then see how audiences would react. The editor, David Bretherton, knew that the film was supposed to be rough and gritty, so he spent 3 weeks assembling a rough cut with takes that highlighted the dancers' imperfections. And when he screened it for Fosse, Fosse stood up and said, "My God, I feel sick," and walked out. He didn't come back until the next day. David, the editor, was understandably nervous and tried to figure out what Fosse wanted, but communication between them was rough. Fosse expected to see every take, and when David thought he'd found a shot that best told the story of a scene, Fosse would erupt over a toe being out of place. And then he'd disappear again, pacing back and forth outside the editing room for hours, offering no feedback, which made David even more nervous. And they had reason for concern. Songwriters Kander and Ebb were shown a rough cut and reacted with dismay. There was another screening for friends and family, and they all just sat there silently. Nobody knew how to react. Fosse started to think maybe this was shaping up to be another disaster. David, the editor, kept struggling to find a cut that worked. With Fosse pacing outside the edit room, David later said, like a panther. Finally, trying to diffuse both their nerves, David asked Fosse if he might like to come inside and sit down, make himself comfortable. Fosse looked at him and said, "Can I tell you something? The reason I don't sit down is because I have the worst case of hemorrhoids anyone ever had." And with that, the walls of communication between them just crumbled. Fosse didn't seem scary anymore. David later said, when he told me that, he became human. Feeling a little bit more comfortable with each other, Bob and David started talking through the problems with the edit. A major issue was the balance of messy takes to perfect takes. Before, it'd just been off, but together they found a solution. Essentially, starting with all the most perfect takes and then carefully adding a few messy ones here and there. As David said, slop it up a bit until it was just right. With the release date drawing close, they held a screening of their latest cuts for some VIPs, including Liza's dad, the director Vincent Minnelli. He was a Hollywood legend, directed Meet Me in St. Louis, An American in Paris, Gigi, many other hits. Vincent watched the film in silence, while Fosse stood at the back of the audience, studying him for any reaction. When the film ended, Vincent took up his coat and headed for the exit. When he passed Fosse, he stopped and said, "I have just seen the perfect movie." And that was certainly promising, but there was still a lot of concern about the reception from the public. Remember, musicals had been declining in popularity. Those that did manage some success tended to be very traditional, like Fiddler on the Roof, Man of La Mancha. This was an extremely different kind of film from what audiences were used to. In fact, when British censors saw it, they gave it an X rating, the first X-rated musical in UK history. One of the issues was that some test audiences were scandalized by the inclusion of a queer character. Most didn't care, but in conservative areas, a preview audience complained about having to see a sex deviant and called it a degenerate movie. Those complaints presented a tricky choice. It would have been possible to cut, or at least reduce, the queer content. And in fact, there were a couple decisions made in the edit to soften the edge. In one scene, the script called for Brian to say, "Fuck Maximilian," to which Sally responds,
"I do."
And then Brian replies,
"So do I."
But that was deemed a little too explicit, and it was replaced with something milder.
Screw Maximilian!
But while Fosse was willing to compromise on using fuck versus screw, he wouldn't budge on straightening the Brian character. That was too important for everyone who worked on the film, from the writer J. Preston Allen, to Fosse and Cy Feuer, to Michael York. Straightening him might have made it easier for some audiences to tolerate, but would have meant losing too much of what they wanted to say, the comparison of 20s Berlin and 60s America. So they left it in, and crossed their fingers for the release. The release date was set for February 13th, 1972. Fosse had put a lot on the line for this movie. His career and his reputation were at stake. He'd suffered through grueling physical work for months. He'd sacrificed relationships, like his friendship with Cy Feuer, and his marriage with Gwen, which was falling apart as he finished work on Cabaret. He'd given up a lot in his pursuit to perfect this movie. And now, it was time to find out if it had been worth it. February 13th came, and
Cabaret was a huge hit.
Critics loved it. Audiences loved it. Against a budget of just $4.6 million, Cabaret made $42 million. That's about equal to $300 million today. Reviewers were stunned by this entirely new kind of musical film. Ebert later wrote, "This is no ordinary musical." Variety called it unusual, literate, bawdy, sophisticated, sensual, cynical, heartwarming, and disturbingly thought-provoking. Pauline Kael at The New Yorker wrote that Liza Minnelli becomes a star before our eyes. It was a success beyond what anyone could have hoped. And it was just the start of an incredible year for Fosse. He felt rejuvenated after the release, and a few months later, headed back to Broadway to direct a new musical, Pippin.
Join us, leave your cheese too sour.
That also was a hit, and it won him a Tony for Best Director. That same year, Fosse approached Liza about creating a television special. It was a big, flashy concert called Liza with a Z, featuring songs from Cabaret's songwriting duo, Kander and Ebb. Liza with a Z is an amazing show. It's shot on film with an intimate documentary style that's totally unlike the slicked, polished musical variety shows common in the 1970s.
Show us the way to get out of this world, for that's where everything is.
Liza with a Z culminates in a high-powered medley of songs from Cabaret.
It's only a cabaret show.
And it won Fosse an Emmy for Best Direction. Then came more good news. Cabaret had been nominated for an Oscar, 9 of them in fact, including for Best Director. No director had ever won an Emmy, a Tony, and an Oscar all in the same year. It would be an incredible feat if Fosse was the first. But that seemed like a long shot, because that same year, The Godfather had come out, and it was a massive blockbuster. Cabaret's box office was a solid $40 million. The Godfather's was $250 million. It was nominated in 11 categories, many overlapping with Cabaret, including Best Director for Francis Ford Coppola, who was already deeply respected for writing the movie Patton. Ebert called The Godfather the best film of 1972. Stanley Kubrick called it perhaps the greatest movie ever made. Up against all that, it didn't seem like a little queer musical stood much of a chance. And so, the night of the Oscars, the cast and crew of Cabaret arrived at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion with low expectations.
All of us are like, we're here and we're going to lose, but at least we got here.
To their surprise, Cabaret racked up some wins early in the evening, including
David Bretherton for Cabaret.
That's the editor who struggled for months with Fosse to find just the right takes.
I only wish tonight that my mouth was, or perhaps as talented as my hands, so I could thank you all very much.
Then it was time for the acting categories.
I was sure I wasn't going to win the Academy Award that year. I was sure Al Pacino would win.
And then?
Joan Gray and Cabaret.
For Best Actress, it was Liza up against Maggie Smith, Diana Ross, Cicely Tyson, Liv Ullmann, giants in their field. And?
Liza Minnelli.
Suspense mounted as the ceremony stretched into hour 3. You can see the various presenters getting a little punchy as it drags on.
We're going to give the scoring awards. And
finally, it was time for Best Director. Fosse versus Francis Ford Coppola. And Joe Mankiewicz, one of the big-name directors who was originally considered for Cabaret. Everybody held their breath, and
Bob Fosse for Cabaret.
It was incredible vindication for all that hard work and all the tough choices. And it was a chance for Bob to mend some fences.
And I'd also like to mention Cy Feuer, the producer, with whom I had a lot of disputes. But on a night like this, you start having affection for everybody. Thank you.
By the end of the night, it was 8 Oscars in total for Cabaret. But what nobody could know that night is how Cabaret would stand the test of time.
I had no idea what that movie was going to turn out to be. None of us did.
Not only did it revitalize Fosse's career and establish the actors as huge stars, it also helped revitalize movie musicals, proving they weren't as dead as everyone thought. Cabaret was followed by other bold movies that dared to try something new, like the rock opera Tommy, Liza's follow-up in the musical drama New York, New York.
Start spreading the news.
Everybody thinks they're Frank Sinatra.
And the film version of Stephen Sondheim's show, A Little Night Music, featuring Diana Rigg decades before she stole the show on Game of Thrones.
I shall make love to your husband.
Cabaret opened the door to much broader experimentation, opened audiences' minds to what music and film could do together.
It sort of ushered in the Sondheim era, and it began a whole new way of seeing musicals.
And it served as inspiration for decades to come, from Rob Marshall's Chicago.
There weren't many movies that succeeded in doing what Cabaret did until Chicago, which can well be called the son of Cabaret.
To Schitt's Creek. And it remains a story with a message that always manages to capture its times. It still resonates with audiences today. Just this year, a revival hit Broadway.
It shows the hope, the joy, the aspiration, but it shows how progress can be taken from you, and we can regress.
And it was nominated for 9 Tonys.
Why does Cabaret keep coming back?
The first answer is the music. It's also, sadly, timeless because it is also a story about encroaching evil and what do we do in the face of it? Do we recognize it? Do we fight it?
Turning Isherwood's stories and his dire warning into a musical film meant taking risk after risk after risk. And in the end, was it all worth it? Well, not only did the movie win all of those accolades, more importantly, it reached people. In Cabaret, Fosse saw a desperately important message, and audiences responded, then and today, because in the end, they recognized what he was trying so urgently to tell us.
Fosse is a landmark. He changed things. And the film Cabaret was one of a kind.
This and some of the other nice things that have happened to me in the last couple of days may turn me into some sort of hopeful optimist and ruin my whole life.
Now, there are lots more stories to tell about the making of Cabaret, like how Liza prepared for her role by visiting lesbian mud wrestling pits. There's a story of how Germany's gay liberation scene is intertwined with tales of gay vampires, and details about the Disney roles that Liza turned down before taking Cabaret. I'm posting bonus videos over on Patreon with details about all of that. And if you like pop culture from the 1970s, you might like my book about the history of queer characters on American sitcoms. Hi Honey, I'm Homo. It's available now wherever books are sold, and you can get a signed, personalized copy. Details for that are at gaysitcoms.com. Thanks to the folks who helped with research for this video, especially at the Seattle Public Library and the Music Library at the University of Washington. And thanks to everybody who makes my videos possible on Patreon. Now, if you'll excuse me, Liza's in the kitchen rustling up some dinner.
Stop it, chicken!